Walter Harris had always been an early riser, even in his youth when he worked long hours at the paper mill in Green Valley, Minnesota. His body clock refused to sleep past dawn. But now, in the winter of his 78th year, Walter didn't wake early out of habit. He woke because sleep was elusive. The house was too quiet. The kind of quiet that echoes, the kind that reminds you just how alone you are. It had been 10 years since his wife Elaine had passed away. They'd been married for 45 years. She died on a Wednesday morning, peacefully, with her favorite blanket tucked under her chin and the scent of lavender still lingering on her pillow. Walter remembered the way her hand felt in his that morning, cold, but not yet stiff. He hadn't let go until the paramedics gently pried her fingers apart. The house on Maple Ridge Road had never been the same. What used to be a haven filled with grandchildren, pot roast dinners, and holiday music had become a shell. Dust gathered in corners she used to sweep. Her slippers still sat by the bed untouched. Walter's two sons, Brian and Tom, had moved across the country. Brian was a lawyer in Boston. Tom was a tech consultant in Seattle. They called. Occasionally, holidays, birthdays, the obligatory, "Hey, Dad, how are you?" That always ended with, "Okay, I've got another meeting. Talk soon." The town itself hadn't changed much. Green Valley had always been small. One gas station, one diner, a post office that closed at 4 p.m., and neighbors who'd known each other since grade school. Walter was somewhat of a fixture, the old man with the plaid coat who always shoveled his own driveway no matter the storm. That morning, the snow had come heavy overnight. Flakes the size of nickels had piled up around his porch steps, and the wind had carved little drifts across the yard. Walter grunted as he pushed the front door open, a burst of cold slapping him in the face. He walked slowly to the woodshed, each step crunching deep into the powder. His knees protested, and his back wasn't much happier, but he got the firewood. He always did. As he turned back toward the house, arms full of birch logs, he heard a sound, faint, barely a whisper against the wind. At first, he thought it was the wind howling between the trees, but then he heard it again, a soft, pitiful mewl. He paused, listening. There. It was coming from the snowbank just to the side of the porch. He squinted, heart fluttering, and in that way it did whenever he stood up too fast. Nestled in the drift was a small gray kitten, so small, in fact, that at first Walter thought it might be a clump of dirty snow. But then it moved, just a twitch of the tail. Its fur was soaked and matted, its eyes half closed. One paw was bent beneath it at an awkward angle. Walter stared for a moment. "Where the hell did you come from?" he muttered, setting down the firewood and kneeling, slowly. The kitten didn't flinch, didn't run. It just stared up at him with wide amber eyes. He could feel the tremble in its tiny body even without touching it. "Damn thing's gonna freeze to death," Walter said to no one in particular. He wrapped the kitten in his scarf and took it inside. Back in the house, he set it gently near the stove on an old flannel towel. The fire hadn't built up yet, but there was enough warmth to make a difference. He filled a saucer with warm milk, though he wasn't sure if kittens even drank milk anymore. What did he know about cats? The kitten licked at the milk slowly, like it wasn't sure it could trust the liquid. Walter watched, arms crossed. "Well, I guess you're staying for now." By evening, the kitten had curled into a tight ball and fallen asleep by the fire. Walter couldn't stop glancing at it. Every time he did, He remembered how Elaine used to beg him to let her adopt a cat. He always refused. Allergies, mess, cost, excuses, really. Now there was a cat in his house, and it hadn't even asked permission. He didn't name it the first day, or the second, but on the third day, when it managed to jump up onto the arm of his recliner and stare at him as if reading his soul, he said, "You're not really a cat, are you? You're more like a ghost, like a whisper." He chuckled. "Whisker, that's what you are." The kitten blinked. "Fine. Whisker it is." Whisker was unlike any cat Walter had ever heard about. He didn't meow for food, didn't scratch the furniture, and didn't even chase shadows. He just watched Walter with those amber eyes, always sitting nearby, always present. It wasn't long before Walter noticed something strange. He had long suffered from bouts of angina, tightness in his chest, shortness of breath. Usually it came without warning, but now, each time he felt a flutter or pain in his chest, Whisker would appear beside him. He'd leap on to Walter's lap, press a paw against his sternum, and purr loudly. The purring filled the room like an engine, a low vibration that seemed to chase the pain away. Walter told no one. He didn't want to sound like a crazy old man. Instead, he went about his days, chopping wood, making stew, listening to old jazz records on the dusty turntable in the den. Whisker followed him everywhere, even outside. The cat hated snow, that much was clear, but he would sit on the windowsill and watch Walter like a sentry until he came back inside. Mrs. Gladys Shaw, his next-door neighbor, came by one afternoon with some banana bread. She peered inside and gasped, "Oh, my, a cat! Walter, I never thought I'd see the day." Walter smiled. "Yeah, he found me, I guess." She bent down to scratch Whisker behind the ears, but the cat backed away, watching her silently. "He's a bit strange, isn't he?" Walter nodded. "Yeah, but he's good company." Winter deepened. The snows came harder, the sky darker, and the nights longer. Walter rarely left the house anymore. His knees hurt too much, and the roads weren't always plowed. Besides, everything he needed was within reach: the fireplace, the radio, and Whisker. There was something about having another presence in the house. It changed things. Walter found himself talking again, not just to the walls or the TV, but to the cat. He'd narrate his cooking process, mumble thoughts aloud, comment on the weather. Whisker never answered, but he always listened. One night, around 2 a.m., Walter woke with a crushing pain in his chest. It was like someone had driven a frozen iron fist into the middle of his ribs and twisted. He couldn't breathe. His vision blurred. He reached for the phone on the nightstand but knocked it to the floor. He tried to call out, but only a whisper came out. Then, as if summoned, Whisker leapt onto the bed. The cat moved deliberately, eyes locked onto Walter's. He placed both front paws on Walter's chest and began to purr. The purring was louder than Walter had ever heard. It wasn't just a sound, it was a vibration. It rattled through his ribs and up into his throat. He could feel it pulsing in sync with his heartbeat, almost guiding it, slowing it, calming it. Minutes passed. Walter wasn't sure how many, but eventually the pain subsided just enough for him to slide off the bed and crawl to the phone. He dialed 911 with trembling fingers. Paramedics arrived 12 minutes later. As they wheeled him out on a stretcher, one of them asked, "How did you manage to call us?" People your age usually pass out before they can move." Walter turned his head toward Whisker, who sat motionless at the top of the stairs. "Had a little help," he said. "Walter stayed in the hospital for 4 days. A minor heart attack, the doctor said. Could have been worse, a lot worse. When his sons heard, they both offered to come. Only Brian did. Tom said the flights were too expensive last minute. Brian, tall and clean-shaven in a blue wool coat, looked at the old house like it was a museum. "Dad, this place isn't safe for you anymore. You need to move." Walter had heard this before, but this time he didn't argue. Lying in a hospital bed changes your perspective. "I'll come," he said, "on one condition." Brian raised an eyebrow. "What?" "I bring the cat." The move to Boston wasn't easy. Packing decades of memories into cardboard boxes hurt more than Walter expected. Elaine's scarves, her cookbooks, the photo albums, each item carried weight. But Whisker made the transition easier. He handled the road trip like a champ, curled in his carrier or on Walter's lap. At rest stops, he'd glance out the window, tail flicking, as if silently judging the scenery. Brian's house was modern, too modern for Walter's taste. Lots of glass, strange chair that hurt his back, and no fireplace. But it was clean, warm, and had a small guest room with a view of a frozen lake. Whisker adjusted quickly. He explored every corner, every drawer, even the dishwasher. Then he returned to Walter's side, resumed his quiet watch. Brian's wife, Sandra, was polite, but distant. She wasn't thrilled about having a cat in the house, but she kept her thoughts mostly to herself. Their daughter Emma, however, adored Whisker. She was 10, sharp as a whip, and always carried a notebook for sketching. She drew Whisker constantly, sitting on windowsills, curled in Walter's lap, perched like royalty on the sofa. One drawing showed Whisker with angel wings. "He saved Grandpa," she said proudly to her friends. Over the next few months, Walter began to feel better than he had in years. His doctors were impressed. His color improved, his appetite returned, and he even walked to the park every other day. Brian arranged for a physical therapist to visit weekly, but the therapist quickly realized that Walter was doing better than most of her other clients. "Whatever you're doing," she said, "keep it." Walter just smiled. He didn't tell her about the nights when Whisker curled up next to him and purred until the pain melted away. One day, while at the vet for a routine checkup, something strange happened. The vet, a young man named Dr. Liam Torres, examined Whisker and frowned. "This cat, he's unusual." Walter raised an eyebrow. "How so?" Dr. Torres checked Whisker's ears, then his eyes. "Well, first off, he has a very rare chromosomal quirk. Not dangerous, just unique. His sensory processing is off the charts. Sight, hearing, smell. He's practically a feline superhero." Walter chuckled. "I believe it." Dr. Torres leaned in. "But there's more. Cats usually avoid people in distress. They hide from emotional stress, but this one, he gravitates toward it. There are even some studies." Walter waved a hand. "You don't need to explain it. I know exactly what he is." Dr. Torres tilted his head. "And what's that?" Walter looked down at Whisker, who blinked slowly. "He's the reason I'm still here." Time passed gently, like snow settling over the world. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months, and Walter found himself building a new routine, one very different from the quiet solitude of his old home in Vermont. He now spent his mornings at the window, sipping weak coffee from a ceramic mug Emma had painted for him, crooked and blue, with a slightly uneven handle. Whisker always sat beside him, tail twitching as he tracked the birds outside. They never talked, not really, but there was an understanding between them, a wordless presence that didn't need explanation. Emma visited every afternoon after school. She'd toss off her backpack, pull out her sketchbook, and climb into the armchair across from Walter. He pretended to read the paper, but in truth, he watched her draw. Always Whisker. "You know," she said one day, "I think Whisker's magic." Walter laughed, a dry, warm sound. "Why's that?" "He only comes when someone's sad, or scared, or hurting, and then they're not anymore." Walter thought for a moment. "Well, if that's not magic, I don't know what is." That evening, Emma left one of her drawings behind. It showed Whisker curled around a heart, his tail forming a perfect circle. Inside the heart, she'd written in big block letters, "You're safe now." Walter tacked it up beside the window. Later that spring, Sandra's father passed away. She flew to Michigan for the funeral. Brian stayed behind with Emma, and for the first time in a long time, Walter found himself helping, not being helped. He made breakfast, sat with his granddaughter while she grieved, reminded Brian to rest. One night, as they sat together in the living room, Brian looked at him and said, "You've changed, Dad." "You're stronger now?" Walter shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe I just remembered what it's like to be needed." Whisker stretched across his lap, blinking slowly as if in agreement. But life, as it does, moved forward, with all its light and shadow. By the next winter, Walter's health had begun to decline again. Subtle things at first, a tremble in his hands, a little confusion in the mornings. Then more serious, trouble standing, chest pains, long naps that left him groggy. The doctors said his heart was weakening. Nothing immediate, they said. But Walter knew he didn't fear it. He'd lived a full life. But what nagged at him was the thought of leaving Whisker behind. One cold December night, Walter lay in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, listening to the ticking of the clock. Whisker lay curled beside him, one paw draped over his arm like a promise. Walter whispered, "I don't want you to be alone when I go." Whisker didn't move, just purred. Christmas came. The house smelled of cinnamon and pine. Emma decorated the tree with drawings of Whisker in tiny costumes, Santa hats, reindeer ears, elf shoes. Walter laughed until he wheezed. That night, Brian helped his father into bed. As he turned to leave, Walter caught his arm. "Promise me something." "Sure, Dad." "Take care of him. He's not just a cat." Brian nodded, swallowing hard. "I know." 3 weeks later, Walter passed quietly in his sleep. Brian found him in the morning, peaceful, a small smile still on his face. Whisker lay beside him, unmoving, head resting on Walter's hand. He didn't eat for 2 days, didn't leave the room. On the third morning he rose, padded into the kitchen, and sat by Emma. She didn't say a word, just pulled him into her arms and cried. They buried Walter under a small tree in the cemetery overlooking the lake. Emma placed a copy of her favorite drawing in the casket, the one that said, "You're safe now." Life adjusted, slowly, awkwardly, but it adjusted. Whisker stayed. He wasn't quite the same, quieter, perhaps more serious. He followed Emma around the house like a shadow. When Brian got migraines, Whisker curled up on his pillow and purred. When Sandra cried silently in the bathroom, he waited outside the door. When Emma stayed up too late, overwhelmed with school and grief, Whisker nudged her toward her bed and lay at her feet. Everyone began to notice.
"Is he always like this?" Sandra asked one evening. Emma smiled. "He's always watching." Years passed. Emma grew, moved out, became an illustrator, published a children's book called Whiskers in the Snow about a magical cat who shows up when people are at their loneliest and teaches them how to feel again. She wrote in the dedication, "For Grandpa Walter, who taught me how to see magic in silence." One summer evening, much later, an elderly neighbor knocked on Emma's door. She'd just moved into a new home, and Whisker, now old and slow, had settled into the sunniest spot on the couch. "I don't mean to bother you," the neighbor said, "but I saw that cat of yours sitting outside my husband's room last night. He passed in his sleep, but I think he waited for someone." Emma didn't say much, just nodded and closed the door. That night, Whisker climbed onto her bed, curled up beside her, and purred. And as she drifted off to sleep, Emma whispered the same words her grandfather once had. "You're not just a cat. I know what you are."